In 1904, Guatemalan President Manuel Estrada Cabrera gave land rights, as well as tax exemption status and control over the railroads to the United Fruit Company in exchange for potential development of the country's infrastructure. By the 1930s, the United Fruit Company became the largest landowner in Guatemala, owning over 556,000 acres of land while also maintaining monopolies over the country's telecommunications, railroads, and port facilities of Puerto Barrios. Now, of that 556,000 acres of land, only about 15% of it was actively cultivated in order to maintain scarcity. And of the 70% of arable land owned by only 2% of the population of Guatemala, only about 12% of it was cultivated. These land grants were often done by taking land from the indigenous Maya population and then giving that to corporations such as the United Fruit Company. At the same time, the people of Guatemala were suffering as well. The literacy rate was only about 30%, and in the 1940s, the life expectancy was about 37 years. In 1931, Jorge Ubico Castaneda, a fascist sympathizer, becomes the next president of Guatemala, and he grants even more exemptions to the United Fruit Company, exempting them from personal income, real estate, and import taxes. Because of this, they can essentially extract wealth from the people of Guatemala, such as in banana exports, and give very little, if anything, in return. In 1950, the United Fruit Company is generating about $65 million in annual revenue, the equivalent of about $900 million today, and that's twice as much as the revenue of the Guatemalan government itself. Ubico himself also starts to rule like a dictator. He implements wage freezes, capping rural farm workers' wages at 20 cents a day, the equivalent to about $4 a day today. At the same time, he also starts a vagrancy law in 1934, where you must prove that you worked between 100 to 150 days on an agricultural estate. If not, you will be forced to work on public roads for no pay at all. In 1935, he imprisons, tortures, and executes hundreds of civilians, workers, and students that he suspects of starting a rebellion against him, later saying, "I am like Hitler. I execute first and start trials afterward." In 1944, Ubico passes Decree 2795, which exempts any landowners from any type of criminal charge if they're acting in defense of their property, which in effect legalizes murder. At the same time, in May of 1944, there is a successful revolt in El Salvador, giving people some degree of hope as to whether or not they can revolt against Ubico himself. In June of 44, protests begin at the university in Guatemala City, and Ubico responds to this by suspending the Constitution. The protests continue, and then a school teacher named Maria Chinchilla Recinos is killed during a peaceful demonstration. This scandal results in Ubico resigning on July 1st before instituting a triumvirate or junta of 3 different generals with the intention of maintaining his rule, however tangentially. This attempt by Ubico to maintain power fails when one of the generals, Federico Ponce Valles, holds the other members of the government at gunpoint and forces them to vote for him, becoming the interim president until October of 1944 in what's known as the October Revolution. Ponce's government is overthrown on October 20th, and after elections, a professor named Juan José Arevalo Bermejo becomes the next president, and he begins instituting various reforms. These reforms include an 8-hour workday, except for plantations, schooling for children of agricultural workers, health and safety standards, and anti-discrimination laws. As a result of this, wages triple for some farmers or increase even more. While these reforms are initially successful, they do concern the interests of the wealthy landowning class, and so in 1949 they attempt to overthrow Arevalo's government using Francisco Javier Arana, a revolutionary leader. Arana threatens Arevalo, claiming that he will start a coup unless his demands are met. In response to this, Arevalo exiles Arana. However, on his way home, Arana's convoy is ambushed by future President Jacobo Arbenz, and in an ensuing gunfight, Arana is killed. Later on, his forces attempt to revolt against the government, however, they are unsuccessful, with about 150 people dying in the process. At Arana's funeral, Arevalo claims that Arana was asked to overthrow the government, and he refused, and he was killed as a result, essentially trying to save face and maintain optics. The truth about this is not revealed for several years, until eventually Arbenz admits to this in 1968. Arbenz is next elected as president in 1950, and during his inauguration, he pledges to turn Guatemala into a functioning capitalist state. The first thing that he needs to do is generate more capital for his projects, so he tries going to the World Bank for a loan. However, due to the influence of the United States, this is refused. So then he turns to land reform. Now remember, about 70% of the country's farmland is only owned by about 2% of the population. Of that 70%, they're only cultivating about 1% of it in order to maintain economic dominance and scarcity. So Arbenz passes Decree 900, where he says, you valued this land as this much in your 1952 tax forms, so the government is going to purchase that from you at that rate, or in the case of the United Fruit Company, for twice as much, and we're going to give that to an impoverished person so that they can cultivate it for themselves, and we're going to give them some starter money so they can start their own business. And this results in about 1,700 of the 350,000 different land holdings in Guatemala being forced to have some of their land expropriated, which is not that severe. However, this results in the United Fruit Company looking to the United States to intervene and to start a revolution to stop this from happening. Now, the United Fruit Company had been lobbying the U.S. government for years to intervene in Guatemala. However, they were unsuccessful during the Truman administration. During the Eisenhower administration, however, they had deeper ties. For instance, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles worked for the same law firm that represented the United Fruit Company, and his brother, Allen Dulles, the director of the CIA, was a board member of the company as well. The United Fruit Company basically convinces Eisenhower that the Guatemalan government is secretly compromised by communists, and this is bolstered by things such as Arbenz allowing a communist party to form in Guatemala, even though he himself was not a communist, and there was only just a few seats in Congress being held by that same party. The CIA then goes to work. They start building different camps in Nicaragua and Honduras, where they fund, arm, and train insurgency groups led by Castillo Armas. They also conduct a campaign of psychological warfare, such as with the radio broadcast Voice of Liberation, where they claim that the reforms being done by Guatemala are a communist plot to replace Catholicism. At the same time, they also claim that the Guatemalan government is a puppet of the USSR in order to build public sympathy towards U.S. intervention. Also, political leaders of the country are mailed things such as non-functional bombs, coffins, and hangman's nooses as a form of death threats. On May 24, 1954, the U.S. launches Operation Hard Rock Baker, a naval blockade of Guatemala. In June of that year, Castillo Armas invades Guatemala. However, Arbenz's forces are so demoralized that they simply stop fighting back. Arbenz decides to resign, mainly because he wants to prevent the likelihood of U.S. invasion, but also because he wants to preserve the victories of the October Revolution. As the next president, Armas would then roll back the reforms instituted by Arevalo and Arbenz, and then he would later repeal the Constitution. He would then imprison and execute thousands of people in concentration camps before being assassinated in 1957. His rollback of reforms would later lead to the 36-year-long Guatemalan Civil War from 1960 to 1996, which resulted in about 200,000 people dying. The 1954 coup would be condemned internationally, with some people calling it economic colonialism. It also ultimately would not benefit the United Fruit Company, as in order to maintain optics, the Eisenhower administration would file an antitrust lawsuit against them in 1958, forcing them to divest. In 1972, the United Fruit Company sold off its last holdings over Guatemala.